we're having, yeah, I'm getting ready for the semester, but today we are, I think what we did last week was we backed off sort of the 3 chapters per week thing. And so today we should be talking, I think that was my cat knocking books over. We should be talking about 7 and 8. So, and I think we, you know, the last time we talked, we were still kind of sort of talking about this kind of question of credibility. And I'm not sure that we, you know, that we need to continue with that discussion, or, you know, or maybe we do want to. So how are people feeling about, you know, the case that Graeber and Wengrow are making, and the evidence that they're using?
Well, I'm fine following their arguments and taking some conclusions at the end of the book. I think that, like, you can see that, like, they're painting a big picture, but they are also, like, using blocks of evidence about the start of agriculture and these early cities, that information there. So, like, I think it would be an interesting exercise closer to the end of the book to see what they have to say about, like, the more relevant things for, like, right now and the politics of, like, current era. But, like, as far as I can see from looking at, like, having, like, put some pages together about those early cities, it's all quite straightforward stuff, and the archaeologists that are digging, like, these sites are saying pretty much the same thing, although the format of the big argument is kind of different. So I'm happy enough just following the argument and maybe waiting to the end to take any big conclusions. I mean, you could dice up their argument and criticize maybe some of the bigger overall things, but I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt, at least while I'm reading the book.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, it seems like some of the things that people were thinking about or sort of objecting to my mind, seem to have more to do with sort of the polemical tone than necessarily, you know, and you know, sort of the Graeber-esque kind of sarcasm. Tim, what's going on? Okay. Okay. So yeah, as long as you can hear us, Tim, we're good. So, I mean, I've been thinking of this actually as I'm preparing for the semester. I've sort of been thinking about the, you know, I'm teaching a historical methods class with a colleague this semester, and we've been talking about, we were planning out our sessions, and there's a week where we're going to talk quite a lot about argument and narrative, and I, you know, so I was saying, well, okay, you know, do you want to do argument? Do you want to do narrative? You know, who wants to do what? And I mean, it does seem like this sort of spectrum from evidence to argument to narrative is involved in kind of the authority and the credibility of the text. But then it's complicated by, you know, sort of that tone issue that I think people have sort of objected to with respect to, you know, the way that Graeber especially likes to approach subjects.
I guess I'm really interested in who people understand, what you all think of. I mean, who it is that they are in dialogue with. When I mean they, I mean Graeber and Wengrow. Because it seems like, and because of course I'm coming to this completely I don't know the literature, I don't know the area, I'm an outsider just being provided this particular narrative. But it seems like one thing is that they're saying the narrative that's goes deep in at least Western culture is not nearly as simple as it's been given to us previously, which seems that with a benefit of a certain amount, 8 chapters or whatever, that seems a kind of an obvious thing to say. And yet narratives told simply are also very powerful narratives. That's partly why we hook, that we hang on to them. And so my main question is this thing about, well, who are they in dialogue with? It seems in a way that I wonder what kinds of conversations are happening about these kinds of materials, meaning the evidence, amongst academics. I imagine there's a lot of that going on, but it seems like that Graeber and Wenger are more in dialogue with people like Diamond or Pinker, these sort of people who are conduits between the general public and academics. And I wonder what people think about that, or what people's experience of that as you've been reading.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, what do people think about the way that they have been addressing these two different communities? Because I think they've said different things in different parts of the book. They've said different things in different videos that I've watched on YouTube, for example.
I'll chime in with one quick thought as a complete amateur here. And the old adage, the more you know, the more you know you don't know. Years ago, I was taken in by Guns, Germs, and Steel, and I thought, oh, this is such a revelation, and it explains the world. And then later you come to find that Diamond is pretty well roasted in the historical community as being lacking in his evidence. Mm-hmm. And
oh, you locked up, Jim. I can't hear you.
Not wanting to hold any opinion too dear and to hold it lightly, because just like everything, it will likely change. I'm not saying I distrust them at all. In fact, I trust them more, but I don't want to hold on to, oh, this is it. This is the truth, because the truth is fleeting and ever to be pursued. So that's where I'm coming from. And I say this just because, Simon, I think you mentioned Diamond. And if I have any skepticism, it's because I generally like to hold it that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that there is this issue of the professional world, and then the, sort of the trade press, who gets to talk to, who gets the book contract to present these ideas to the general public. It always sort of blew my mind and interested me that Richard Dawkins' position title at Oxford was apparently science communication, something along those lines, right? That was kind of his bailiwick, and that was seen, and this would have been decades ago, as something that people should be paying attention to, right? But I think there is a huge, there's a huge difference between, and I think Wengro talks about this occasionally. And I'm not sure if he did it in the one that they did while Graeber was still alive, but I've certainly seen him in a couple of book talks since the book has come out, where he said, well, a lot of these things are things that are well known by professionals in my field, but the world somehow has not caught up with that. And I think to a great extent, that's because professionals they talk amongst themselves. Right? And they don't necessarily get, they're not good at perhaps writing for the general public. And they don't get, they leave a vacuum for people like Diamond and then, and Pinker and Harari to kind of weigh in and say things that are not as fact-based and not as based in, the most current information as they could be. And then of course, when you're pulling stuff from another discipline, then you've got that additional challenge.
And the general public is not inclined to go look for this either. So there's, we as a culture seem to be turning away from experts more and more. Yeah. And it's up to us. And I consider myself, as I said, a complete amateur. I need to go look for this. And if I don't, it's on me just as much as it is maybe for an expert not sharing. So. Yeah. And that's one of the things that did sort of impress me about their, about really kind of the extensive, discursive endnotes and, and the number of citations in there and the length of the bibliography. It certainly is work kind of verifying that. I think, in a lot of cases, I think people, sometimes sort of dip into one or two, look at them extensively to kind of get a reading on, whether they should believe, right? And then at some point they decide, okay, I'm gonna give them the benefit of the doubt on these things that I don't know the information because of the job they did on these couple that I checked.
Also, I don't think that there's much of a market for but I think would be a really interesting book, which is somebody saying, let me walk you through the debates that the authorities or the people who are really deeply studying in this field are having. And we tend to get books by people like Diamond or Graeber and Wenrow, which is like, here's my idea, or here's this idea I had from all this stuff, and I'm going to tell you sort of how I've crystallized all this information, rather than saying, let me walk you through what the debate is amongst the professionals. And I would find that fascinating, but I don't think there's much of a market for that.
Yeah, that may be. Tim.
Yeah, thanks. Similar to Jim, I think, because there's been two other instances over and above the Jade d'Amande and the Guns, Germs and Steel, which, yes, was very much my introduction to this field back when it was originally published. I can think of two things that have really happened. One is the other way. You go back to my early geology education, and plate tectonics, for instance, had just about landed for the undergraduate, but hadn't really landed in the schools at the time in the UK. And of course, you go back 20, 30 years before that, and the guy who came up with plate tectonics was deemed an absolute fruitcake and a nutcase, such that at the time, all the school textbooks were full of these ginormous 3,000-mile land bridges to explain why different mammals, particularly, were in, the Africa versus the South American, etc. continent. And yet, by the time that I'd finished my normal school stuff, plate tectonics was on the local TV as being the standard popular science program. And so that was a positive one in that sense. The other negative one, but is a little bit more recent, is something like Bjorn Lomborg's Skeptical Environmentalist. He's over as a statistician. That's his bag. He then writes stuff about climate change and similar, and gets absolutely panned for getting the science wrong, yet he's still around in the sense of those people that look after numbers and understand money and project management and politics still see him as being a positive force, or at least a somebody to debate with, yet he's still getting all the science wrong. And yet, if you look at the original publication and the original flame war that came out of the big Scientific American 20-odd page critique of the Skeptical Environmentalist, which was a book that was about the same number of words as this one, with the same sort of level of numbers of footnotes, if not the depth of the footnotes. And that debate still goes on. You know, you still end up with, you know, merchants of doubt explaining why that discussion is still going on. You go look at, say, John Cook out of Australia as the communicator, how to talk to deniers from climate change, and the skill set is clearly wholly different to the person who's writing the first stage primary science type paper on this is the next bit of where the next bit of CO2 comes from that we've missed by other model to date, etc. And all that discussion is going on. And because that discussion is going on, the deniers are using it against the discussion. So there was that. And last session, which I missed, but I managed to catch up on the vid, was you raised a similar problem with the ongoing discussion about the megaphone extinctions that are historically put down to people migrations, particularly into the Americas, whereby all the mastodons disappeared, the then American horses went until the Spanish brought them back. And partly because of this, but also because of things like rewilding and climate change, etc. I've been dipping into that on and off a year plus, I suppose. And it very much seems to be that it's 6 of one and half a dozen the other. Humans arriving may well not have been the cause, but it was effectively the final straw. And it's part of normal evolution, as I see it. Something changes, people turn up, or humanoids turn up, and they change that environment. So something's going to give. And particularly with your, as you also mentioned, with the Australian, New Zealand, and Pacific Polynesia, with all the big flightless birds, they're clearly going to go on the way out compared to the saber-toothed tiger type scenario. So that all seems to me to start linking up. But again, because it's very much multidisciplinary, it's still many experts talking in their own silo and less crossing those normal boundaries, such that not even professional boundaries and professional multidisciplinary groups aren't doing or aren't able to evolve as well as they might. So again, as Jim mentioned, we have our own duty, but so do sufficient professionals have to talk outwards, not just in their own silo. And this is an attempt. How good it is, I still don't know, because I've got to the end. But it's good enough in everything I've checked out so far, and some of those things I've checked are rechecks of what's been discussed. And other things is, oh, that's an interesting point to me. I'll go check that because of my bent and my interests and all this. And so I think there's a good number of instances of similar things coming out and being fleshed out, such that older biases are being laid to rest, and some of those have been perpetuated through just because people like, say, Jacques Diamond has really focused on his area, but tried to extrapolate without necessarily doing as much work as he could, and fallen foul of things have moved on since he's looked at it. Things are moving on while he's looking at it. So I don't know that in his terms is at fault for an ism type reason, you know, a racism or a political type reason, versus why Paul Lomberg is wrong and is still wrong, in spite of the fact he's still trying to push it's not really a problem agenda. So, you know, I think he's got to take his licks and maybe respond once the dust has settled a bit. I haven't seen anything from him on this yet, but then I'm not necessarily going to be looking in the same places yet. Maybe somebody's picked it up. I haven't seen it noted down in the Obsidian yet either, but maybe somebody has. Just haven't known it.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's three for now.
I think there's a couple of things involved in that, right? There's the types of data, and there's a similarity in what's going on in the present with arguments about the present, because you can argue about the types of data and which data we think are important. And this happens in history a lot. There are a bunch of different, sort of sub-disciplines of history, and some people look at a particular type of evidence and give it precedence over others, right? So social historians have a different take from cultural historians or political historians. In this prehistoric setting that Graeber and Wengrow are dealing with here, maybe there's a little bit less of that, but I think, going back to also one of the things that Kathleen said earlier, I think, Kathleen, what you were talking about was kind of this sense of sort of magisterial authority of the way that these statements about the past and about truth and claims are made. And there have been, there are a couple of examples that I can think of off the top. Jared Diamond is kind of magisterial. Charles Mann in 1491 and 1493 talks a lot more about the, what in my field we would call the historiography of it, right? That there's this, especially in the Amazon, and Graeber and Wengrow talk a little bit about the Amazon in these chapters. This fight over whether or not the Amazon could have supported large populations, right? And the whole Betty Metzger versus what's her name, Anna Roosevelt argument in that book, which was kind of generational, but also had to do with more data becoming available, but also had to do with apparently Metzger's really sincere belief that if she, not only did she kind of have a stake in the ground in terms of her own reputation and her own research, but also if she gave in and said, well, okay, people did live here in ways that we didn't account for in the past, that would open the door to a bunch of new development and cutting down and slashing and burning of more Amazonian rainforest, and which was obviously not the outcome that we were hoping, that we were looking for and that we were feeling we needed at the time. So, so there's a complicated kind of a relationship there. But I guess my point is that it is possible, perhaps, to talk more about, the way Mann did, about, the fact that these that information is changing, that arguments are being put forward for a variety of different reasons by people who are, fallible and human and have their own agendas and, and all of those things. So yeah, I think there's definitely an interesting dynamic going on here, and especially also with respect to the way, and I guess, just having listened to each of them separately, the way that it seems like Graeber, probably was Graeber, has decided to, to sort of present his argument. He does seem to like to tilt at the windmills of these people who have been super successful in making these kind of magisterial, authoritative blanket statements about, kind of the way things were, sort of retroactively fitting data to their, to support their thesis, seems to be, maybe an element of that as well. Go ahead, Simon.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because I think even I think Kathleen on the very first day of when there was dozens of us, I seem to remember you described it as a sort of a page turner. That it was it's quite extraordinary in the sense that it's dealing with more or less anthropology and archaeology, and yet it does have that feeling of being incredibly engrossing. And yet at the same time, it's also it's a curious thing because it's not like it's a bestseller. So it's a very strange kind of middle ground between having a relationship to an academic context, and I'm guessing that the majority of us have some relation to the academy, but I don't know that. But and yet it's also not just existing in that world, and so it's a very, very curious kind of niche sort of area in terms of its audience. And yet it's also has that sort of sense of being a polemic as well, not fully, but it's like it's a kind of an evidence-based polemic, and it's it's a really such a pleasure to read. But I share Jim, I share that idea you're describing, which is not holding on to any opinion, I think, too dear or something like that. Anyway, yeah, really fascinating.
Yeah, and maybe there's a tradition of these things becoming more polemical, because actually, as you're saying that, Simon, I'm reminded sort of Taleb, right, who is very polemical in in this progression from fooled by randomness to the black swan to anti-fragile. It just gets more, and his position becomes more defined and and maybe a little bit more out there. Go ahead, Kathleen. Are you muted?
I think one of the things, to piggyback on something that Simon said, it is an engrossing read, but I'm the kind of person who geeks out over, oh my God, a description of ancient civilizations, how fascinating. But also, I think the big advantage for this book is it's got basically one big idea that most people can accept, which is there was this old way, or a way that maybe is still current, of understanding, how we got from where we were to where we are now, and let's reevaluate that. And so I think for someone like me, who's sort of a hobby reader of this kind of thing, it's easy to digest this book because there's the engrossing stuff, but I also know what their big idea is, and I can put what they're saying in the context of that big idea, but I can also push back on local points without necessarily, undoing the Jenga tower of their big idea. In other words, you can object to local parts of the book, like I'm still not sure about that whole their theory of how the Enlightenment, got from indigenous people to, to other beliefs about freedom, etc. But it doesn't undo the whole book if you don't buy one particular part of it. And so I think that's one of the things that I'm finding really attractive about the book. I can engage with it without hurling it across the room in disgust and saying, oh my God, this is just something I can't digest at all. And I think that's one of its strengths, actually, is you can accept their general premise. You can appreciate their viewpoint of, there are actually perspectives other than this sort of Western Enlightenment-based tradition through which we look at the developments of regimes and societies, without having to say, I just got to walk away from this book. I can't, which was my response to, I think, one of the Taleb books. I was like, I'm done here, so, yeah.
Yeah, I think it may be that, that what we end up on the other end with is a kind of, it's complicated, right? Sort of a message, right? That there was this idea, and to some extent, it probably has to do with the stakes, right? Because for the longest time before there was a lot of this new generation of archaeological evidence, it seemed like that stuff was so far away and so remote and so kind of unknowable that people didn't question as much, who I mean, it's almost like follow the money, or who benefits, right? Who benefits from there being, these kind of myths of the distant past. And then, yeah, and if they do, I feel comfortable with the idea that it's all much more complicated, and that there isn't, that it's not possible to kind of, and that it's sort of required to question these universal statements about, and especially when they, and this is where the sarcasm maybe comes in handy, right? When they point out that, wait a minute, we've physically, modern humans, Homo sapiens, have been physically able to do these things, from 200,000 years ago, and only started doing them 5,000 years ago. What's up with that? And so, yeah, I think that is a huge contribution, even if that's all that it is, right? How about Lewis Plessy? What do you think?
Plessy. Remind me again.
I'm sorry. I just interested in hearing your thoughts about this. I'm sort of I'm kind of scrolling through the chapter as we're talking about this. There's a lot of talk in the 7th chapter about this agricultural change, and this sort of rejection of this inevitability of immediate organization and hierarchy and all of these things. And it does seem like Kathleen is saying, that there are enough different examples where things happen differently that, I mean, are we satisfied that at the least we can say that, it's impossible to generalize in the way that we've, sort of been in the habit of doing in the past?
Definitely, for sure. I mean, I think it's clear that the story with agriculture is very messy, and it overlaps with the story about cities and like what a city might be, and the fact that like we can see these sort of proto-cities, these sort of social constructs that may be a little bit unfamiliar as cities to us, but definitely work in a geographically concentrated area, but also in a wider geographical area. That mean that I think that it's clear that the sort of the idea of this sort of linear progression that goes along with the technological progression hand in hand is kind of like bust flush. It's like it's hard to reconcile those things, but it's also hard to know. Like I'm waiting for like, and I've seen that this story is broken, but I'm waiting in the next chapters for an alternative model to be built up, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it does seem like one of the things that is happening as they're bringing more and more evidence in is there are more opportunities for there to be sort of local differences, right? I mean, when you can analyze, the isotopes in bones to find out what people's diets were and things like that, that kind of creates an explosion of new potential data, so they can talk about, who was eating what in what different places. I think that can only make the story, more complex and more, more varied.
Dan, was there, and maybe this is a discussion held in another group, and I've kind of gone off on tangents as I see links to other things. This is one of my problems with reading this, is that I'll find something and I'll go off and I don't get back to the book. But regardless, the question I'm coming to you is about literacy and how that might create all of these variables. So you have agriculture and you have other variables, but then there's literacy or lack of it, and how that might have created changes or not changes. Do you have any insight into that larger question?
In these societies in various places?
Yes. And I just, it's kind of such a broad and general question. I don't know if it's fair to ask of it, but I see it as one of the variables that may be at play here.
Yeah, it's too bad Chris Alders isn't here because he would have some things to say about pre-literate oral mnemonic traditions and things like that.
And maybe that's where it's coming from. So if it needs to be saved for another time, I'm fine with that.
Well, I think that probably a lot of this, I mean, my guess would be that a lot of this transition to agriculture was much more. It started much earlier. It seems like the evidence is showing, and it was much more gradual, and with starts and stops and people choosing different things for different reasons. That probably, I mean, I would guess that a lot of it happened in pre-literate times, right? Because if we figure that that we get writing sometime between 6,000 and 5,000 years ago in places like China and Mesopotamia, then it certainly seems like a lot of this stuff was happening before then. So the transmission of knowledge would have been different at least kind of up until that time, right? We did have a talk, I think it was last week, didn't we, about sort of whether things get more whether things open up, whether knowledge is decentralized when new media like writing and then printing and then and then other things later in the more modern era become available, or whether it's another opportunity for people to centralize it and say, well, this exists only for the literate few in a society like Mesopotamia, where only the scribes were writing and reading. Yeah, I think there's I think that's an interesting question, but I don't think it's one that I've seen them resolving yet so far in the thing. What do other people think? Tim, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I'd like to jump back in here. Just as a bit of a background, last time I was employed, I was with a worldwide corporate that had 4,500 staff here, and we had like 200 nationalities. So language was always a thing. Obviously, corporate language was English, thankfully for me, because I don't speak another language properly anyway. But it was often, even with my senior position, I would often have to go to training sessions with middle and lower managers. And there would always be this thing, oh shit, there's a senior director in the class. How do we cope with this? So one of the things that was accidental the first time, but we then made sure it was sort of repeated, was the lecturer would often be a person of colour as opposed to a white Brit or a white American, and would say something like, no speaking native language. So I'd get up to go and leave, because obviously my native language is English, where I'm sitting next to a Dutch person with a Chinese person on the other side and an Indonesian in front and an Arab behind me and a Kenyan round the corner. And it would break the ice. But it comes back to partly what Jim had started talking about. I see, and you've mentioned it once or twice, about Brits particularly like to talk about English language versus the abortion that you guys over on the tea terrorist tax dodging side use. And the two things come to mind. Partly with this agriculture thing, if you look at the English word for the animal, it's always an old Anglo-Saxon word: cow, pig, deer. But the food you get from it is a boss's word, as in a Norman French Viking word, as in beef, pork, and venison. And you see that in a lot of other parts of the world. So words used in law and for taxes and for management are very often French style words versus, you know, bricks, soil, old styles of management, as in the Saxon reed, how to manage people and how to administer justice at that level, pre-Norman conquest. You've got a whole different set of words being used for meetings of those people who have power and have the ability to dispense justice. And it's somewhat more decentralized in Saxon times than it was come Norman times. And to me, it came over as being much more like the Americans, as we're using the American term here, as in the Northeast Indians taking the Mickey out the bad French because they don't look after people. And the one that struck me was paying a fine from the family fine rather than necessarily the individual, because there's no corporate punishment, or there's less corporate punishment. And that was a Saxon thing as well, but the Normans overrid it, and then the Normans really brought in capital punishment in the extreme. And we have similar here now in the Middle East. If you cause an injury or a death by traffic accidents, you pay a fine to the family of the person you injured, not necessarily to the state. Whereas if you were in the UK, the fine would go to the state. They may pay some of that money, or pay some money because you don't keep track of which pound notes you give away to the injured person, but it won't be the value of the blood money that you pay. And the other one on language, finally, is of course, my grandfather was beaten for speaking native language in the school playground as a Welshman under a English imposed school regime back in the 20s. So it's, while some of what Jim was talking about, I think is very fixed to us in the modern world, where we expect, particularly from the Western development, we expect everybody to be able to read and write. And it's unusual. You know, I've worked as a local authority librarian and had to help some people who are 20, 30 years older than me read, and be semi-embarrassed by being in the children's library because that's where the easy to read books are, as a 40-year-old adult, and I'm there as a school leaver type job between my school time and my proper professional life. And yet here, half of the labour can't read and write. Yet they're pouring the concrete and doing the reinforcement, and albeit under semi-slave wages type thing, they're earning more than they would do at home, but they're earning it here. But they can't really read or write. They know the Quran because it's taught by rote. It's a pre-written, learned item. So they can do their prayers and all the rest of it. They can't read the Quran, and they speak Urdu anyway. They're parroting the Arabic. They don't fully understand. And it's a bit like when I first went to Germany, because I grew up in London, they asked me if I'd ever seen a cow. But I was 1 mile from a major farmer's market which had an abattoir attached. So I'd seen sheep, pigs and cows going in and out, going in as live animals and coming out of joints as meat. So it wasn't as though I was detached, like many city dwellers are. They don't know how to sow a bean, let alone be able to sow a bean and a melon and a sweet corn to make the Three Sisters, for instance. But I see a lot of that coming back. You look at current gardening, current regen agriculture technologies that's being pushed around, and look at permaculture stuff, all of that multi-cropping, perennial cropping, get away from annuals that are now being so inbred and so factory farmed that it's destroying the soil. And we've got big soil erosion problems like the Dust Bowl from the 30s in the States becoming just as much of a problem. They're all now pushing themselves to say, no, we're not farming the crop, we're farming the soil. And we want to do it with tree crops, and we want to do it with fruit crops and perennial crops, and use animals in a different way to replace the megafauna, to replace the bison herds, etc., from the prairies, to keep those environments going. All that seems to be coming back. And a lot of it's being said, oh, we want to get the indigenous knowledge. We do and we don't, I think. It's a case of we want to readjust things a bit. It's not that far away. You know, there's almost living memory to when the Dance with Wolves type thing was, this week, if I remember rightly, the oldest person in the States died, 112 years old or whatever he was. Oh. Not that far detached, yet nobody really remembers pre-Saxon England anymore in the context, clearly. So there is stuff to learn, that's for sure. And the knocking the likes of Diamond off his financial perch because of his popularist books might well be an element of the motivation for some people. But ultimately, it's also bringing back things that are misunderstood, or we don't necessarily know why we do things in those cases. Yet textbooks still talk about how medieval times farmed land, 1 acre is 1 day's worth of plowing. You have a fallow year or several fallow years. You put it down to temporary pasture. That's still happening in a lot of places. It's just not happening enough to give us a better food base. But
so
change.
So to pursue this kind of idea of knowledge, right? One of the things that Graeber and Wenger are talking about, and they mention it several times, is that, sort of people's worlds narrow as population increases, right? And this seems to be kind of a thesis that they have, which, Tim, I sort of, in my mind, that's sort of connected to, what you're talking about, kind of knowledge contracting and but then that also, that's adjacent to kind of the standard story, which is population increase, more people living, also maybe goes hand in hand with many people living less well, right? Because that's a thing that has been in the literature for quite a while, right? Is that that the origin of farming led to, and again, this is coming out of people's isotope analysis of people's diets and as shown in their bones and stuff like that, that there are less that people, that there are more people alive, but but the standard of living for many has perhaps decreased, and that maybe is is indicative of the beginning of social classes, right, of inequality, but that kind of goes hand in hand with division of labor, right, with the idea that, well, okay, if there's a food surplus, then people can turn to other things, right? So this whole kind of urban story becomes quite complicated, and it's not entirely clear to me which specific things, which elements of that story are, maybe locally valid, or whether we can again generalize them out to a bigger to a bigger story of what happened when there were larger populations. I mean, these two chapters are the ones where we have people beginning to live in communities of more than 10,000 people, right? And so what happens then? And this population rises from 5 million at the beginning of the Holocene to almost 1 billion by 1800 because of these agricultural surpluses. And then so what of the story do we want to believe? And then I guess maybe the additional question is, where do Graeber's especially, and maybe even Wengrow's, I don't know about his ideological commitments, where do they become operative in the way we feel about these changes? Kathleen, you look like you want to chime in there.
Smiling because I know Graeber definitely is an anarchist, and it's impossible not to have that in mind when you read this book, because he's clearly making a case that anarchy can work. Now, whether it would work now, I don't know, but he's clearly, I'm not saying that he's trying to say anarchy is the answer, but he's clearly, to me at least, trying to make the point that there are other ways of organizing ourselves. And yes, there are ways in which an anarchist frame can really guide a society. So that's the only reason I'm selling this.
Yeah. No, I like that. I like that as well. And that argument against the inevitability of where we ended up, I think even if it doesn't go to a place that is ultimately anarchist,
right.
That's more flexible. Yeah, certainly I would think that would be part of, I'm expecting to see that at the end of the book.
Yeah, I think one of my big takeaways from the book, and I'm just about into chapter 11, is that they're really arguing against any kind of teleological view about where humanity has been and is heading, and that there's sort of no inevitability for anything, and which is kind of refreshing in a certain way. You can say, well, we don't necessarily have to end up where we think we're headed. So it's an anti-theological understanding of history or whatever.
I agree, and I think that would be interesting. And I don't know if they're going to go there in enough detail, or if maybe later somebody will, there'll be some additional unpublished, stuff. But they've been, or Graeber seems to me to have kind of come out of a Marxian tradition.
Yes, absolutely.
And so where do they part ways, right? Where do you?
I
think
I was thinking of that. Yeah.
It's interesting to me that I'm enjoying the book, but there are people in my life, or people we all know, that I can't even tell them I'm reading the book because the A word, anarchy. One person in particular would blow up. But you're reading an anarchist? He wouldn't touch it. But yet I know this person in his more libertarian leanings, it's more complicated than that, but he would be probably really refreshed by the idea that we can actually think about, we can think about a different world. We can reorganize ourselves in a way that would be even more closely to his worldview, but they won't touch it because of the perceived biases, real or imagined. And it's just interesting how the world reacts to that. That's part of
absolutely. Yeah. And that, agency is agency, isn't it? Whether you think of it from a libertarian perspective or for an anti-statist, and libertarians are anti-statist as well. They just, come at it from a different direction.
Yeah. The book would excite him, but he literally wouldn't touch it because of the perceptions he has about who wrote it. And it's like, don't be afraid of the idea, which is part of my problem with certain conservative mindsets, is that they won't even engage with an idea just because it is, well, it might mean they might have to change their mind, which is anathema to a conservative brain. I think, didn't we even learn that from Daniel Kahneman, that there's built-in circuits in our brain that are different in certain people than others, and resistance to change is one of those interesting components.
Yeah,
I'm digressing again.
No, I think that's super relevant. I remember I had a couple of semester or two ago, I had a student, and this was when I was using a published textbook and a reader, companion primary source reader that came with it. And and we got to the, to the 19th century, and I was reading from Proudhon, and it was the, property is theft passage. And the introduction, the editor's introduction to the passage said, Proudhon was a famous early socialist. Mm-hmm. And it was, and for some of my students, that was as far as they read, right? And it was like, oh, he's a socialist. I'm not going to read, I'm not going to read this passage. Or if I'm going to read it, my mind is already closed. I've already decided who this guy is and, and what he's about. And so I actually, the next time, the following semester, when I used the same reading, I used it without the introduction. And I said, okay, who is the, who do you think this guy is? What do you think he's saying, after just reading what he wrote, rather than, how he was, how he's framed.
Even a confusion of what the word liberal means. If you tell someone, I have a liberal arts education, they'll react in horror because the word liberal is there, or we live in a liberal democracy, without an understanding of what the word means and its upper and lowercase uses. And it's like you talk about language police, you almost have to change a language just to get around the mental constructs people have about what things might or may not mean.
Yeah, it's insane. I live in northern Minnesota, which is a very red part of what generally, because of the urban population, turns out to be a blue state. And we are at my little university, we are thinking of changing the liberal education requirement, the core requirements, to call them core requirements or core curriculum instead, because so many parents of first generation college students have come in and said, what are you teaching my kid?
Yeah, part of the craziness of our time.
Yeah.
Yeah. I found that because I sort of read some of the reviews in talking about the sort of anarchist perspective on it. I was really confused because it doesn't, and I don't know Graeber's writing well enough, so I didn't sort of come with that baggage. So because it doesn't seem like there's anything anarchic at all in a statement or in a thesis, which is things aren't as we might have imagined them to be, and there might be other ways of living. They're not; those are not big statements or sort of anarchic statements. But it does. I was trying to track down where I heard it, but slightly tangentially, which is what's the point in having a mind if you never change it? That's the kind of the sort of just to your that statement you were saying, Jim, or the thing you were saying. But anyway.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, there was a reviewer in, gosh, I don't remember where it was. Might have been The Nation, but who spent more time talking about, Zuccotti Park and Graeber as the activist than about actually what was in the book. And I thought that was kind of unfortunate because I think there's. I do think that that maybe Simon, the implication is that the reason to challenge these master narratives is the thing that people are objecting to and suspecting at the outset, right? That okay, they're subverting our belief in the inevitable rise of hierarchy. And we've got to object to that. We've got to push back on that.
Dan, I'm curious. Does what you've read and what you've been exposed to, and I know you have such a wide range of reading and academic learning, but does what you're reading today change how you might teach historiography to your undergraduate students to help them put history into context, how they might think about it differently, more openly, in order to change their mind about how to interpret history? Is it changing how you teach?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I actually, and even, I had already sort of been teaching in my modern world history course, which I teach every semester, I had already sort of been decentering Europe and, and kind of the what I had thought was the master narrative. But I had been telling a story of, kind of going back to the origins of agriculture, because I figure not everybody who takes modern world history has taken ancient, right? It's a 2-course, it's a 2-semester sequence, but a lot of my students hadn't taken the previous course. So I did, I usually did a kind of an introductory review thing, week long, kind of lecture and discussion where I talked about the origins of agriculture. And I always sort of did talk about it. I mean, I did decenter Mesopotamia and say, that's not the only place, right? There are all of these different staple crops, and and in the top 5 staple crops, right? 3 of them of today's top 5 staple crops, maize, potatoes, and cassava, were invented by Native Americans, right? So, so I was already doing that, but yeah, I've actually gone back since reading this and rewritten that whole unit to sort of complicate even further, the origin of this shift to urbanity and to hierarchy and to kingdoms. Yeah, because I was kind of going with that story that agriculture led to population rise, which led to, sort of the stuff that Bill Wirtz talks about in, the history of the entire world, I guess, where you've got a lot of people, you've got, I control the farming, so I get the bigger house. It's a very cartoonish thing, but that's, to a great extent, that even that's what we're turning these things into cartoons when we tell these synthetic general textbook stories a lot of the time, which is really unfortunate.
I'm trying to become more comfortable with uncertainty and complication, and as using that as a general worldview. And I think this book is good basis for me to hold even firmer to that idea that I need to progress towards that, again, being comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yeah, well, and really, it's a real challenge to, it's not the only challenge, but it's a challenge to the idea that there is a historical truth, and that there is a kind of a big picture story that we should be telling. Because if every time we sort of zoom in, it's fractal, and there's more going on, then the question is, do these little, is it really fractal? Are these little elements in the interior, as you zoom in, still self-similar with the big picture of, the Mandelbrot set when you look at it from the outside? And that's, I think, not a given, right? It's not a foregone conclusion.
I like the fractal idea.
It just came to my head.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'll use it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really stuck on this. It's slightly going back to this thing about I'm caught between this sort of ad hominem attacks, meaning that that the person is attacked rather than the idea, and then I'm on the flip side. I remember a long time ago, this is in the arts world, of people complaining about reviewers and wanting to know the last sort of 8 to 10 reviews that a reviewer had done. So in order to get a sense of their taste, that until you knew the taste of the reviewer, it would be very hard to understand the perspective from which they're responding to a piece of art. Mm-hmm. And so I'm really caught between this sort of thing. Actually, it's important that we understand, in this case, Graeber's background. And I'm sort of zipping back to this, but it's just I'm really kind of caught between those two perspectives. I think ideally I'd say I wouldn't want to know. I don't think it's important to know. And yet, actually, that framing is an important one at the same time, to understand the genesis of the kind of framing of this evidence. And so, yeah, I'm really, it's sticky for me.
I think in the case of Graeber, it's useful to know about his basically that he's an anarchist, because it signals that he's open to a different way of thinking about, how societies and regimes coalesce. And it's actually interesting when I think about, I live in Manhattan, so when I think about Zuccotti Park and the sort of the way they valiantly tried to do sort of the consensus building kind of organization without a hierarchy, et cetera. And it's hard not to think about that when I read Graeber's account of certain kinds of early and emergent cities, where he really is open to the idea that maybe the archaeological evidence is telling us that there was no hierarchy, or that there was some other consensus way of making decisions, running your irrigation system, or whatever it is you need to do. So I think in that sense, I don't think you need to read the book as a treatise arguing for anarchy so much as appreciating somebody's point of view, helping them to open their mind up to a different way of looking at things. You know, at the end of the day, I wouldn't want to lock myself into his point of view, but I think I can appreciate knowing his background, and especially the way he tried to handle the Occupy movement as a lens to how he's evaluating the archaeological evidence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, I would agree. Go ahead, Louis.
You're muted.
Well, you may. Yeah, you are still muted.
Yes, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
It was good what you were
Yes,
saying, I'm sure.
I wasn't aware that Graeber. I wasn't aware that Graeber was an anarchist until we started, talking about it in these talks. I mean, I think it. I'm wondering if it's fair to say that if politically what you want to do in the future is based on like going back to the past, if the story of the past is changing, that's going to be a problem for you.
I think the thing is though that everybody, and I think historians have more recently tried to sort of express our position before we start talking about history. And so you start to, I think I'm beginning to see that more in more histories, that people are sort of identifying themselves and, and kind of where they stand. Because I think the assumption is that, at least the assumption today amongst historians, I think, is that everyone has done that always, but it used to be invisible, right? Because we used to be, sort of secure in our little cultural cocoon, and our assumptions and biases and heuristics were all invisible to us, right? And especially if we were in the dominant, kind of white Eurocentric, Enlightenment culture, that was, we didn't have to, and occasionally, that would have been attacked by some people as, the Whig interpretation of history, right? If it was too triumphalist and too, we've come out of this scary dark past to this, to this moment of achievement of the present. But even the people who were objecting to that weren't necessarily examining their own invisible, kind of culture. And I don't want to, I do think that it's possible to take that, too far into deconstruction and, and into a kind of a nihilistic place, but it's probably necessary to take a lot farther than most people are probably initially comfortable with, before we start to question whether we've reached that end of its usefulness. I don't know, Simon, you're kind of coming out of a almost literature adjacent kind of field. What do you think about, the kind of whole postmodern cultural critique?
Yeah, it's really, I was just thinking then that their kind of claims to truth are, they're really, they're propositional. Like I sort of feel like they're owning the uncertainty of it, and yet also doing it in a way which is, as I was saying before, as a kind of a page turner, it's gripping. And so I think that's a curious line to straddle or to balance. I mean, I guess the thing that, you know, in kind of the world I'm in, the weight of identity and the way in which identity weighs on the things we say and who and what claims are being made is pretty intense. And so it's not surprising to me that in our culture, when I say our, I guess I'm saying more or less the States and the US, you know, the so-called global North, that it's not surprising that we end up in ad hominem land, because identity becomes so precious. And so there's again, I feel very much probably quite a conservative. I have quite a conservative perspective in terms of the arts and humanities, and yet I'm not at all in terms of the way in which you might say the world is seen. So I find it very very challenging to place the idea and the person, and to separate the idea from the person who is making the claim, and as much as I would want to. So there's, I kind of see both perspectives really, and I really struggle with it. I don't know if that's answering your question, but oof,
that's cool. That's interesting. You know, I think part of it also in the case of Graeber, you know, maybe, you know, to some extent has to do with, you know, not giving a shit. And you know, because he's, you know, because of his history, you know, because of his, you know, his career trajectory, you know, where another person, you know, the other guy, you know, when you say anarchism in a historical context, the other guy that I think of is James Scott, who I wrote about in the vault a little bit, and he has been writing about and thinking about this sort of tension and relationship between individuals and states, you know, for his entire career. And the second to most recent of his books, I think, before Against the Grain, which also talks about this early agricultural period, it was called Two Cheers for Anarchism. And, you know, and that's one that I haven't read. I've read most of his other books, but I haven't read that one yet. But I've always wondered about that title. Is, you know, are you saying two cheers because you're still an academic and you still value your position at Yale University and as the, you know, the managing editor of the Agrarian Studies series at the Yale Press? You know, what's going on there?
I love it because, I mean, I've not read it, but I just really like that it's not fully committed. It's not three cheers, is it? It's just two.
Right.
More than one, but not three.
Yeah, it's complicated.
Yeah. I'm not putting all my eggs in the, you know.
Yeah. So, so we have a lot of, in these chapters, we have a lot of examples, right? We have a lot of details. You know, when I finally have finished processing this, you know, my graph is going to be much more populated with links. Just a little details like, you know, ancient Athens was largely fed by Black Sea grain. Okay, that's a you know, that's cool. I like that. Yeah, so I'm geeking out on the you know, these little things. And I actually did start reading the article that preceded this from 2015 or whatever, about the I guess it was the dawn. It was the one that used Dawn of Humanity in its title, you know, abandoning the dawn of humanity idea. And that one did seem to be, you know, to go back to kind of this idea of the difference between academic writing for academics and, you know, and this type of thing, which tries to kind of cobble together narrativity and polemic and, you know, and all of these things. And a little bit of snarkiness. It seemed like the article, ironically, was much more straightforward for me, and it was much more easy for me to kind of follow their train of thought from point A to point B to point C, and see that it wasn't, you know, exploding into some big claim, right? It was just kind of a series of very sequential and logical kind of statements. I'm just looking for the end of this this chapter now.
You on 7 or 8 there, Dan? Which do you mean?
I was looking for the end of 8. I figure we've got 12 minutes to go, so I'm going to find out where the end of 8 is, and see what what other things might have jumped out at me. Are we at Mohenjo-Daro? That's the Great Bath. So there are a bunch of kind of claims that they make about the what they take to be the implications of things like the existence of the Great Bath, the shift. They tell this story about Teotihuacan, right? About the kind of the beginning, this potentially beginning period where they're building pyramids, and then they sort of back away from that. How convincing did that seem to everybody? These stories, or these interpretations of what they think they're seeing in the archaeological data.
I have no way of truly assessing it. I mean, they mentioned a couple of times that everybody accepts that there are markers of kingship and hierarchy. I'm going to take them at their word that there are, and that if I were to look through professional eyes at an archaeological site, I would be able to say, oh yeah, clearly there was a king here or there wasn't. I thought the idea, I talk about going down a rabbit hole. I went down the Teotihuacan rabbit hole a couple of days ago because I had no idea. And the idea that somebody would say, I'm living in a city that doesn't have enough housing. And I'm thinking, yeah, let's just plow everything down and build some nice apartments for everyone. But it just never occurred to me that you could extract that kind of information about how a society is organized and where they decide that they're going to reorient themselves just by looking at markers in the material culture and the physical environment. So it was one of those things where I decided I was just going to have to take on faith that we can look at a site and say, yes, this indicates that there was a king or a hierarchy, or that there was no king or no hierarchy or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I had a chance to walk that site a couple of years ago, and it's amazing reading about it. I didn't know then what I do now. I need to go back and have a greater appreciation for what I was walking in and what I was seeing, and I would go in with new eyes if I went back today.
Yeah, I haven't been there. Haven't been to anywhere around Mexico City.
It's amazing, but there's a lot to learn.
I was thinking they do make they make the point more than once, which is when there have been kings, they leave a lot of stuff around. Like they're and also pretty clear that it's much harder to talk about things that were never there. You're making claims for things that weren't there, and so there's which of course is a particular kind of way of thinking about history in general anyway. But yeah, so I just really appreciate that. I just really, let's make the claim, but yes, it's messy stuff for sure.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting that what I hadn't really understood about Göbekli Tepe was how much of it hasn't really been uncovered yet. Apparently, it's not only this one of the oldest megalithic sites that they found, but it's also apparently, based on ground penetrating radar, one of the biggest, and they've only kind of scratched the surface of it. So yeah, I think it's an exciting time.
A good reminder that there's more to learn even after reading this book.
Yeah, a lot more. Yeah, and that interpretations will continue to need to evolve. Yeah, I mean, there's also a claim along the way that that the building of the pyramids in Egypt was a seasonal activity, which again, I'm not sure how I feel about that, but it's an interesting, counter narrative to the things that we thought were sort of foregone conclusions about the way things like that were built. Yeah, I just like the fact that so much of this throws so much into that bucket of the jury's still out on it.
Can I ask a quick procedural question?
Mhm.
I might have missed this or just forgotten. Is there a central point of communication besides the Obsidian Vault? Because I know a time was changed for the meeting a week or so ago, and I didn't get that message. Is there a place you can remind me where things are centralized here?
No, that's my fault. Aside from the community dialogue page, really, I didn't set up a kind of a central, like a mailing list or anything like that.
Okay, and no problem. It's not an issue. I just thought maybe I had missed something.
No, that was no, that was also my fault that I didn't actually make announcements early enough, especially for that holiday week.
Yeah,
so
that's fine.
Yeah, sorry about that. So yeah, I mean, there's so much. I'm just kind of scrolling through my my notes and my highlights, and the whole, I mean, they talk a lot about kind of cultural forms, right? Democracy. Towards the end of the 8th chapter, around 319, they're talking about democracy. They're talking about the Sangha in they're talking about it in terms of the Buddhist world, but seems like they should be talking about it in terms of what goes on ahead of time. And apparently there's a lot, there's still some controversy about the identity of the Buddha and the location of his life and all of that. So so it's interesting that that a lot of this stuff is a lot of these stories that again we thought were sort of nailed down are and maybe it's just a new world in which things that had been previously nailed down can be challenged, but especially these traditions of of people who we think of as historical characters, and a lot of them turn out to be religious, the originators of religions, right, are not necessarily, and so that fascinates me as well, because I'm sort of always interested in those types of things. But any kind of last thoughts before we go?
Just love that. I just wanted to say I love that little moment in chapter 8 when they're talking about biological kinship and say many humans just don't like their families very much. I just cracked up at this idea that somehow we would imagine that things would have been different then, that people would have got on just perfectly amongst their sort of happy band of brothers. So yeah, I just really enjoyed that.
Right. Yeah, because you're stuck with that immediate family little band of 25 or fewer people.
I had that same reaction, Simon. I read it last night.
Dunbar's number. Sorry.
I read that last night and had the same reaction.
Yeah. Yeah, which might, that's the whole to make that I thought of it in terms of kind of a Jerry Seinfeld sort of a moment, right? Where, you know, that's why I live in a city. So, all right, cool. Well, next week we will once again meet on a Friday. I'll probably be in my office at school because I'll be between classes, and we will talk about 9 and 10, which are kind of going to continue, I think, a lot of the same things that were. It's been a while since I've looked at them, but I will dig back into them.
Thank you again for
Thanks,
taking time to
Dan.
do this, Dan.
Yeah, and thanks everyone.
You
Really
bet.
good to chat.
You bet. Thanks.
Bye.
Good talking with you.
Have a good weekend.
Yeah. See you in a
Bye now.
week. Bye-bye.